Blasphemous 2 is a Metroidvania sequel to the original Blasphemous. Both games were made by the Spanish studio The Game Kitchen. What made the first game special was its art direction, which was deeply informed by Spanish Roman Catholicism and the architecture of their home. Blasphemous was a unique kind of game in its genre that leaned into Souls influences. And by that, I mean specifically slow, weighty combat that relied on parries and commitments to animation. Platforming existed, but was not a primary focus, save for some later DLC content. It was a tad bare, especially on release, but every ounce of it oozed effort. Yet, it was a special kind of game because there weren't a lot of Metroidvanias like it and stood as an artistic work on its own within its genre. The most important thing a work can do is have identity and mean something, even if it means different things to different people. Blasphemous 2 does not seek to reinvent the wheel. Instead, it specifically took leftover ideas and cut concepts and fleshed out into a new game where they considered many of the criticisms of the previous one. A great example here is the original game's combat had a very bare-bones system. It had one single weapon and a pretty small tech tree to upgrade throughout, mostly formed by things you'd find within the world to power the sword up. Here, it's a more involved RPG system. There's an economy of a more complex tech tree with experience points and currency. There's 3 weapons to add to the complexity that have their own utilities. One is a giant mace bell, hits twice typically, can be set on fire, and hits hard. It also goes further than the other weapons, but it hits very slow. There's a dagger and rapier combo for those dex build sickos out there, with a unique kind of parry and electricity buff with a very fast hit ratio. The third is pretty much a mea culpa clone, which means it's basically the sword from the first game, though if I think there was a side-by-side, I would think that the sword has slightly less range than mea culpa, but it's basically the same. Either way, they're all very interesting, and what's better is that those weapons have abilities for movement and progression within the world. You have to commit to one weapon at the start of the game, meaning your progression at the start changes based on your choice, and the other 2 weapons are within the areas of the game to find. This, along with its more complex and satisfying map design, leads to a much more considered level design than the original game. The original game was decent about having a screen or an area with good obstacles or a combat challenge, but lacked sort of an interconnected, smart progression of a more developed and pronounced Metroidvania game. I'm now very curious to see how people route this game at the start, and that sort of thing is really impressive. And it's still well designed where the game clearly funnels you into certain areas and options. I appreciate a good structure even when a Metroidvania is non-linear, and the game is pretty smart about it. The game has to be smart about it. The enemy scaling and the weapons with the XP system sort of mean you're able to go to anywhere you can go, and they need to be at a reasonable damage level. So like in the first game, the order of where you can go and what you can do can be switched, but was dependent basically on your skill because enemies and areas were naturally harder, both in design and literal numbers and scaling. This is an easy player communication, but they were able to fix that while having a more balanced approach despite its limitations. So that's super impressive. And then in the back half of the game, it gets linear in terms of the main path, but radically opens up in side content and collectibles. I think this game is the game that confirms to me I'd rather a linear core progression in the back half of a game than a front half of the game. Dark Souls 2, you got it right again. A front half's open design allows the player to sort of set up their experience and expectations on their terms comfortably. Then real tests can happen in the back half to ensure you've made proper decisions and developed proper skills. There's a lot of enemy recolors, but I don't particularly find that a problem because it sort of opens up into like early GBA Castlevania games where the recolors feed into the elemental systems of the game. The additional equipments are often elemental resistances, for instance, and the weapons have their own elements for enemy weaknesses, encouraging this kind of rock, paper, scissors play. I think there's enough variation in the recolors that it's fine in gameplay, but it does hit one of the core problems with the game I have. And let me be clear, I think this is probably a better game. than the first Blasphemous. But artistically speaking, I think Blasphemous 1 blows this game out of the water. This is a case of a better game, but not a better artistic work. The charm and artistic direction oozed out of the first, with unique enemies and bosses and animations. Blasphemous 2 has a lot of enemy recolors. Many enemies from the first game. Cutscenes are now not within the graphics of the pixels, but rather this more traditional drawn animation style, and that looks higher in production value, but ignores a sort of like grit to the first game. Another good example is the bosses. A lot of the bosses are more of the Dark Souls variety, where it sort of introduces you, oh, these are the bosses, and they're all dudes in armor, and it's a bunch of different penitents, and they're all different kinds of knights, and they have different elements, and they have different attack patterns that aren't just, you know, a typical thing, but deep down, fundamentally, they're not very different from each other. The original game's enemy variety was pretty high. Every boss in the original game is vividly memorable, artistically, and in design. And it's telling that the big monster enemies of Blasphemous 2 are at the back end of the game and have very simple attack patterns. Very intricate in how they look, but aside from like one, there's like, most of them have only like 1 or 2 or 3 attack things, like very easy to answer. One of them is the fucking final boss. Still, with the combat being as fluid and satisfying as it is, I don't think it's necessarily a problem. It's fun, and it's much easier than the limited options of the first title. Maybe a lot of the additional content can also be added by the DLC. A lot of these problems can be fixed in DLC. There's already hints of additional content, and for Blasphemous 1, additional content was pretty much required, in my opinion. They really fixed up the game by the end of its lifespan. The Game Kitchen does seem to have an ear on the buzz and chatter of the game, and I'm glad everyone enjoys it so much. I think one of the misplaced criticisms is the parry system. A lot of people think the parries feel weird now, and you're right, they do. The dagger rapier combo has a different parry timing and response than Mea Culpa or this sword does. This sword has the traditional, the normal sword has the traditional Mea Culpa parry timing, but in both instances, the parry isn't necessarily safe even when you land it. Sometimes you get knocked back or unable to parry follow-ups due to a change in attack or timing. The knockback can also be particularly frustrating because you can be parried into a corner and then punished for just because you had proper timing. I think parrying isn't the end-all be-all it was in the first game, and there's a lot more emphasis on movement this time around. The movement options for me reminded me of a much more traditional Metroidvania by the end. You know, it's where you're not really even seeing the enemies on screen, you're just jumping over hurdles as you jump dash around the screen navigating. There's plenty of movement options in these areas and arenas to suit this idea. And I think the parries really shouldn't be touched. I think that was fine the way it is. And overall, I loved Blasphemous 2. I think even though I find certain artistic aspects lacking compared to the first game, this is a much better textbook design of polish and game design. And the Game Kitchen were really able to showcase how much they've learned and grown as developers. The art is still gorgeous, the themes and story are still interesting, and the game is still mad fun. So go check out Blasphemous 2 today.